materially constitutes what she says as the translocal state of not being of this place. How do we arrive at a translocal state where one is not of the place where one is? First question. So that's a question of let's explore, let's examine, and then let's describe. And the second question is, what's the relation between this displaced mode of existence and the representational techniques of computer simulation? And I think you understand where I'm going with that, because I want to, if we can figure out first what is the translocal state of being, then secondly we should be interesting to find out how that relates to the financial system, to the great decentered multinational communicational space in which we're caught as individual subjects. To quote Jameson again. One way to start is to think about the world of Wal-mart, obviously, because it may not mean that much to Europeans, and all the Latin American countries except Mexico have resisted Wal-mart pretty well, but for the U.S. it is like enormous.
Well, Wal-mart was even in Germany.
It was, and it was kicked out.
Yeah.
It was kicked out. Major victory for Germany, I'm sure.
Yeah.
This map, what this map does is it represents the nations of the world according to the amount of Wal-mart activity in each one. So you see that China is the biggest Wal-mart nation in the world, followed closely by the United States. Mexico is about in its proper proportion to the United States. You know, Brazil matters here. You know, you can see Pakistan is way outsized. Indonesia and whatnot do have their share. A lot of tennis shoes made there. Japan doesn't even exist. Neither does Europe. I mean, look, here's Germany. That's what's left of Wal-mart. There seems to be a little bit in Italy. You know, I guess, what is this up here?
Ireland?
Ireland? I don't know.
Succeeded.
Sorry?
Succeeded.
No, it's not the shape. Well, yeah, I don't know.
It does look like Ireland.
Looks like Ireland to me, but I'm not so familiar with the Irish flag so much. Anyway, the world of Wal-mart, which, you know, is clearly the world of this chain of production that goes mainly from Asia by container ship to a complex system of truck distribution, you know, and the trucks then distribute those goods to warehouses, which then distribute them to stores. So that's the basic pattern. Most of the Wal-mart world comes to the shore, not on the East Coast, but over here in Los Angeles, in the United States, and the two ports of Los Angeles, which are extremely big. So you have a thing called intermodal transport, or containerization. It's based on three pillars. Standardization of the box, the container itself, that thing that the guy is living in, which allows you to stack it in ships and transfer it by cranes to truck or rail. Another thing that's important, continuous traceability, thanks to a machine-readable bill of lading, almost like a barcode, so that you always know, the person managing this always know where the container is. Otherwise, people would not trust this system. And finally, the ability to lock the door on the shipment from the initial departure to the final destination. Otherwise, again, people wouldn't trust, so that's very important. Standardized containers had been used a little bit in local areas since the late 19th century, but this intermodal transport, intermodal means it's going from from truck to ship, potentially to rail, to truck, and then to its destination. So there are different modes of, and the whole thing is to have smooth fit between each mode. So it's always the same container. They used to ship things on pallets, and the pallets had to be stacked. It took workers weeks to unload a ship, and now it takes them days, and they do it with machines and sometimes with automated machines. So this has really changed things. Globalization is impossible without this stuff. So intermodalism dates back to 1956, when this guy, Malcolm McLean, loaded 58 aluminum truck bodies onto a tanker called the Ideal X for shipment from Newark to Houston. It's like a water-to-wheels concept, tremendous increases in speed and security, big savings on labor. People in the U.S. soon recognized that this was offered, a huge sort of increase in efficiency, and a standardization process began standardization is key to everything about globalization. It's because of technical standardization that people are able to communicate with each other, first to receive letters, then telegraphs, then telegraphs, then telephone calls, then electronic communications. So standardization, in this case, it was launched by the US and it spread around the world, and everyone adopted the same standards for container transport. So the container is the material equivalent of a packet sent to the internet switching network. That's how internet thing is. You have a standardized packet. It's always the same packet. Inside is everything. Inside is all your messages, all your dreams, all your hopes, and so on. In the same way, the standardized container contains all your goods, all your clothes, your lifestyle, your particular expression of yourself, etc., your iMac, your whatever. It's all in the same standardized container. So I would say that the container is the equivalent of the data of the Internet Transfer Protocol, the so-called packet switching networks. It also required deregulation because there used to be all those union controls on trucking. Trucking was a very strong union in the United States, still is in France. But so they resisted that, the unions of the truckers, but above all the unions of the dockers, which were the strongest labor unions in all the world because the most international ones. A dockers strike used to be able to stop an entire economy. Nowadays, what they've done is they've replaced, there are almost no dockers. There are a lot of engineers controlling the cranes. Engineers don't go on strike because they're well paid. So this was a very strong blow to the working class movements, and it legally was accomplished by what's called deregulation. So the rationalization of the docks, that means the imposition of a new, more efficient technology, broke the power of the longshoremen's unions, historically the strongest and most internationalist sector of the labor movement. These developments smoothed the way for an integrated intermodal system that spread across the world, slashing freight costs and making logistics the key operational discipline of the globalizing economy. Given the military origins of logistics, it's significant that the first government contracts with McLean's Sea Land Corporation were for war materiel to Vietnam. And it's equally significant that Sea Land's wartime business became immensely profitable when McLean realized that the returning containers of course which were emptied in Saigon and Cam Ranh Bay, could be filled by stopping in Japan on the way back. So you stop in Japan, then you have a two-way trade, and it becomes really profitable. And that's how an industry starts. When it's really profitable, when it starts to get standardized, then investors will come in and invest, and this thing spreads. And indeed, it's now become the universal mode of transportation for the globalized economy. So what we live in with this global division of labor is a system of just-in-time production. So it's not all about containers, it's also about how things are produced. Now, in the late 60s, the Japanese economy really began to take off. First, they were producing light consumer goods, they were producing batteries, the stuff that China now produces, and so on. But then, especially after 1973, their very efficient automobiles started to be a big, big product. Now, 1973, the Vietnam War is still going on, right? It goes on all the way till 1975. Now, the Toyota Motor Company corporation had already developed a system, which is the system of just-in-time production, of continuous information flow between manufacturer and supplier, allowing for the delivery of custom-built parts in exact proportion to current needs without costly warehousing. This is called the Kanban system. It's something very interesting. American car manufacturers would they would demand the lowest price possible for, say, the clock that goes in the automobile. And they would hunt around, they wouldn't tell anybody what they were going to use it for, they would just competitively look, and then they would buy as many as they can to have it ready when they need it for production. So they had to have big warehouses full of clocks, full of batteries, full of seats, and so on and so on. For anything that they didn't produce inside, they had to have all this storage. Plus they didn't really collaborate with their suppliers, they just looked for the cheapest one. The Japanese practiced something entirely different. They decided that every time they contracted with someone, they would try to establish relations of trust. They would set up a system where the company who was going to build the clock would know exactly what the car was going to look like and would build the perfect clock for what they considered to be the perfect car. Moreover, they set up an information system where they would send that company every day notice of how much clocks they expected to need the next day or the next week. So they never had a pile of clocks. And they never wasted money on clocks that they didn't use. And not only that, because they told the manufacturers everything about the clock they wanted, they didn't get, like the American car manufacturers, 4 or 5 clocks that don't work in each shipment. So they eliminated massive amounts of waste, both on the storage of the things and on the quality control. They applied the same use of information flow inside the factory. So in a factory, what you have, and it's great to go to factories and see how these things work, or even maybe work them if you haven't done, I've done that. You have big boxes in factories next to the assembly. So here we are on the assembly lines doing this all day, and we go over there and we get one of these, and then you do that, you do that, you do that, and then we go over there and we get another one, right? So those boxes, when they're empty, actually, what they usually do is they just push it off the side and they get another one, and they just build up, and there's boxes everywhere. What the Japanese do is they put a little slip of paper in the box, and they'd send it back to another part of the factory. And at the other part of the factory, they would tally up everything that's been done, and they would send that information to the supplier. So what you're talking about is a factory with continuous information flow, both inside the factory and to all the outsourced things, done with paper cards, called Kanban cards. This all existing before computers. Obviously, when the Americans and the Europeans saw that, it was already the late 70s, and the first thing they thought was, we could informationalize all of this. Japanese were thinking that as well. And the Americans and Europeans did see that because the Japanese car industry was destroying them. It was making better cars, more fuel-efficient cars, and those cars were cheaper. So the American and European car industries were in the midst of an existential crisis. They had to adapt Japanese methods, and they had to somehow make them better. So they did, and they informationalized all this to the max. And what happened was they got it together to do a study, which took years to do, most of the 1980s, which produced a book called The Machine That Changed the World. The machine was not just a single machine. It wasn't just like the Toyota Civic or something. It was the entire factory process. The factory considered, and not just the factory, but its outsourcing networks and its mode of selling the cars was all considered as a machine. Because the Japanese also had another thing. They wouldn't make the car until it had already been sold. That meant they weren't going to have a warehouse with thousands of cars rusting and not being sold, because they didn't even produce the car if they had not already gone out and sold the car. And they got their clients to accept to wait a week or even as much as 3 weeks for the car with this argument. We're going to build exactly the car you want. You don't want a clock? We won't put the clock in. You want it to be orange? Obviously it will be orange, etc., etc., etc. So the Japanese had a system. And that system was very elegantly described as the machine that changed the world in a book that was a study that was funded by Detroit, that is by the American car industry, by the consortium of European car industries, and by the Japanese themselves. And I think the driving force was Agnelli from the Fiat, I think was one of the drivers, but I forget, I'm not really sure about that. So what I'm kind of trying to say is that there in Japan, that this just-in-time production system had already been extended, not just to Japan, but to the whole Japanese productive network, including East Asia. So after it was understood what the Japanese were doing, just-in-time production would be extended to the whole world. And in that respect, the title, The Machine That Changed the World, is really serious. It's a good title. And so what I claim is that just-in-time production is what made the world translocal. That's how we get in this translocal state of not being of this place. Because no longer will any country really exist on the things which come from that country. Now we will exist in a global division of labor where part of what we are working with is always coming from great distances. And we will exist in that intermeshing flow of just-in-time production and distribution. Because obviously it's not just about production, it's also about getting the goods in time to that distant place where they're going to be consumed. So, and then this guy Mark Levinson, who wrote a book called The Box, where he describes the birth of the container itself, and how he says, he describes the effects of these practices on an American consumer icon as early as the mid-1990s. Workers in China produced her statuesque figure using molds from the United States and other machines from Japan and Europe. Her nylon hair was Japanese, the plastic in her body from Taiwan, the pigments American, the cotton clothing from China. Barbie, simple girl though she is, had developed her very own global supply chain. And it was only yesterday when I was looking at this again that I realized what the hell they were actually making. In fact, they were making or something, maybe it's Ken or G.I. Joe or whatever. Anyway, it's pretty hilarious. So the questions are, how are global flows coordinated with local markets to make a profit in real time? And what effects do the giant distribution machines have on the stationary people who ultimately receive and consume the mobile commodities? To answer that, we kind of have to go back in time. And this is another thing that you do when you practice kind of Foucauldian critique. You want to know something about subjectivity. You want to know what effect do these machines have on the people, who are connected to them. So to do that, you look back in time to see who originated this kind of system. And the idea for a Foucauldian critique is that you don't look just to the obvious thing. You don't look just to the machine that changed the world. You try to go deeper than that. So you look to this guy. His name is J. Wright Forrester. He's the author, among many other things, of this book called Industrial Dynamics. J. Wright Forrester is an engineer. He worked at MIT during the war. During the war, he invented a thing called dynamic core memory for computers. The reason why is that he was on a project to make an all-purpose computer for the Air Force called the Whirlwind computer. Significantly, this was supposed to be used as a flight simulator. So it was supposed to create that simulated kind of environment, that environment of images and signs that we talk about in the financial market. He did it, and not only that, but he presided over the whole effort which made those radar stations which were connected to computers which formed the aerial anti-missile defense of the United States during the 1950s, called the SAGE early warning system, or SAGE means semi-automated ground environment. So this guy, who is a brilliant guy, was in the heart of the American military-industrial complex. By the mid-1950s, I think it was only 1956 or something, he decided that the action was over in the computer world, and he decided to move to the business school of Harvard, which had been funded by General Motors. It's called the Sloan Business School, and he would become the head of that business school and develop this science of industrial dynamics. Now, what does that mean? Basically, it's like this. He discovered that people running factories big factories had a very hard time coordinating all the bits of their operations, and they continually found themselves with one of two problems. Either they had produced tons of things and nobody wanted them, or they were unable to produce the things that people wanted because they were missing one or two parts of the production line. So what he said you had to do, he said that these factories are too big, too complex for people to understand, and we have to invent a way of representing and simulating what's going on. So Forrester was convinced that industrial managers were unable to grasp the multiple rhythms of giant plants hooked into even larger distribution systems. And he thought they were actually worsening the problems instead of curing them. So he designed a nonlinear computer modeling program. Nonlinear means that the things fluctuate independently of each other. to show how policy decision affecting the rates of flow between 5 categories of things, of stocks, that is, say, materials, orders for those materials, money, capital equipment, the kind of productive equipment that actually produces things, and personnel, could be represented graphically in their effects over time so as to reveal the unforeseen consequences of single interventions. Policy decisions could then be corrected via a 6th category, coordinated feedback information. This analysis laid the basis of a new managerial logic known as system dynamics. So what he did was he created a computer modeling program that would represent over time the relations between these 5 different things. And he tried to show where the curves fluctuated with relation to each other. And by looking in the past, say this was the point where you knew there was there had been a big problem, right? You could look at that, analyze it, and say, oh, what happened was, well, this curve was going up. We didn't realize it, but this one was going down. So in a similar situation in the future, when you know this curve is going to go up, you put all the efforts into making this one go up too, so that you can bring these curves into some kind of harmony. And I find it a visually very strange thing to look at. The point was not so much, the point was to educate the managers so that they would begin to be able to grasp the complexity of the operation they were involved in. The reason why is because the factories were getting so big, but also because the market for those factories, it had extended even beyond the United States. You know, at that time, the United States was furnishing about half the automobiles used in the world, that is to say in the early 60s before the American decline began. And so these factories were really big and very complicated. Forster went even further than that, and he attempted to sketch out the effects of the production of advertising on the inventory, on the whole supply chain. So he shows time, like this is weeks, you know, how long it takes to plan, how long it takes for the advertising industry to take its decisions, the agencies and the media to execute them. Then it takes time for the advertising to build up its effects. And you have to calculate all this so that you have the inventory to deliver to the public. These decisions between production and the different places where inventory takes place, at the factory, at the distributors, and at the retailers, the same time frame. You have to have the same time frame. Otherwise, the advertising will produce a big demand here from the public, and the inventory won't be ready yet. So again, you have to map that out all in advance and coordinate all these distinct operations. Now, it's really incredible that when you look at the history of cybernetics, you'll find Norbert Wiener everywhere. You will never find Forster, almost never, because he's basically an engineer and a manager. And yet he's one of the key figures in the history of cybernetics because his work has allowed the coordination of vast production, distribution, and consumption processes taking place on opposite sides of the planet. I mean, his semi-automated ground environment that he invented to control all those radar stations up in Alaska and out in Hawaii and all that, he was on a plane and he found himself next to, I believe it was an American Airlines vice president. And they had a conversation, and he said, boy, I could really do something for you, or maybe it was the vice president, I don't know, you could really do something for us. And they invented, on the basis of the semi-automated ground environment, they invented this thing called SABRE, the semi-automated business research environment. When you buy a ticket today, you still use this system, which came into, I forget when it came into effect, it was during the late 50s. So, you know, of course, an airline is a vastly complex thing. You've got to sell tickets to people who are living in Japan, but they're going to fly from Geneva to Berlin, and the plane can only hold 100 people, and there has to be a meal for that person on that day in Geneva, and it may be also they cancel the reservation, in which case you probably better not buy the meal, and so on and so on and so on. That machine that Forster invented is still doing that. It does it for the SNCF in France. I think it does it, they also use the same stuff for Deutsche Bahn, and so on and so on and so on. Incredibly long-lived sort of, I mean, it's probably been improved quite a lot since then, but it's still basically that. So I find that the ease with which we ignore the very existence of such crucial transport system has everything to do with what you might call a technological unconscious. We live in a world where we have no idea what's going on. And that's, I don't know a better definition of the unconscious. To live when you have no idea what's going on, you know? So there's a technological unconscious. And Nigel Thrift, who is an interesting British geographer, describes this unconscious, which, you know, arises from the automation of large numbers of routine actions to which we no longer pay the slightest attention. So Nigel Thrift explains this sort of repetition compulsion in the following way. He says, through the application of a set of technologies and knowledges, the two being impossible to separate, a style of repetition has been produced which is more controlled and also more open-ended, a new kind of roving empiricism which continually ties up and undoes itself in the search for the most efficient ways to use the space and time of each moment. Now that ties up and undoes itself is obviously something where I would like you to think of that image, you know. This ties up and does itself, right? This is the representational machinery trying to track how complicated all those operations are, trying to make it visible for us, or at least for the managers, how these automated production and distribution activities are tying themselves into knots and then doing this, how they're actually unfolding in real time. And so, as the designer of semi-automatic environments, including human beings in subordination to mechanical and computational devices, Forrester was at the origin of this roving technological unconscious. Yet he found his ideas weren't understood by the corporate class he was addressing. Only in the 1980s did they start making intuitive sense to managers. That's something also very interesting. The American Airlines people were able to understand. But the majority of managers who came in contact with this stuff in the 60s and the 70s, they didn't get it. They only started to get it in the 80s when computerization really came on. In other words, when we had made the switch. We made the switch from Keynesian Fordism to neoliberal informationalism. That's when it started to become intuitive, because people started to be used to the idea that information could make a difference at a distance in real time, immediately. And that information could make an essential difference in the way you carry on something as pragmatic as producing and distributing goods, and also marketing them, advertising them, selling them, you know? So, it's an interesting thing. Now, what I was talking about there is the prehistory, the genealogy. Now let's talk about the present. From the 1980s onward, quantum leaps in data gathering and communications technology transformed all. With the advent of what's now called electronic data interchange, or EDI, every aspect of production, transport, display, and sales can be recorded, communicated, represented, and analyzed, so as to continuously map out the position and trajectory of each single object being handled by a world-spanning corporation. The result is what they call an executive information system that gives managers centralized access, basically practically at an iPad, but it's actually more a corporate, you know, workstation, over continuously evolving sets of logistical data, bringing dynamic simulation over the line into real-time representation. That's to say, when Forrester did it, he was just simulating something approximately like what was happening in the factory. Now they look at it and they see exactly what is happening in the factory. They see exactly what's happening in the relationship between the factory, the entire chain of distribution, and the point of sale, you know? And that point of sale thing, you know that when you go and you pay with a credit card, right? There's collected what they call point of sale data. Obviously, they know what's been sold. That's very important for the inventory and for that whole chain. But they also collect data about you, what you have bought before, what you tend to be interested in, what you buy at the supermarket because the supermarket sells them that information. They can also buy, if they're lucky, some information about your health care, which will tell them everything about how much money you earn and what kind of person you are, etc., etc., etc. So, this provides the unprecedented ability, first of all, to rationalize labor at every point along the chain, accelerating the pace and squeezing workers for higher levels of productivity. Still, that's not enough for contemporary capitalism. As the systems designer, Paul Westerman explains, aggressive retailers, this is the guy who built Wal-mart's information system. He says this, quote, aggressive retailers like Wal-mart will not stop there. They will continue until all company data is available for analysis. They will build an enterprise data warehouse. They give all this information to their internal users, the buyers, and external users, suppliers, to exploit and demand measurable improvement. So in other words, they're doing like the Japanese did. They're trying to get their suppliers and also the people who buy something from them to fit into the machine that's changing the world. You have to provide this just in time. You have to tell us who is buying what and why, and that's how we're going to make this thing faster. And they do it very aggressively. They force people, they bargain with people. Walmart is now famous for pushing everybody down because they're always asking for a lower price. There's a decent film out there called The High Price of Low Cost. The high price is that labor is exploited to the max, the environment is devastated, we're inundated with shitty products, and not only that, we're trained to consume all this crap. There is a very high price for the low cost that Walmart and its those who emulate it insist upon. So such is the formula of global supply chain management in an information age economy where the push of forced industrial production and state planning has been replaced by the pull of giant retail conglomerates. Boy, what does that mean? That means that in the old days, when you had a very big factory, what you did is you just pushed the products out in the world, and you tried to force everyone to consume them with advertising campaigns and all that. Now what they do is they wait for the pull. That is to say, they wait to find out what people want this season. They do that with that whole forecasting machinery, you know. If you're a good-looking guy or girl, maybe someday, obviously, Serge, I'm here, the best-looking among us, will probably be approached one day or the other to ask what kind of tennis shoes he now fancies, you know? And maybe they'll even put him in a little environment with nice-looking boys and girls, and then they'll see sort of how he talks about his tennis shoes or something like that. And they'll use that information as, they'll consider that that is the pull. That's what the market's looking for this season. Maybe they'll even fly the boys and girls to Hawaii or somewhere warm because it's winter and they want to see how they're going to be acting in the summer. This is crazy stuff. It's called forecasting. It exists, and it's part of this whole pull economy. Excuse me for making you into part of it. Sort of. It's not really very fair. However, the violence that I exert in the classroom is really not very comparable to what they do either. So, with enterprise data warehousing, the just-in-time machine becomes both extensively and intensively pervasive. That is to say, not only is it everywhere in space, it's also intensive, it's under your skin. Electronic data integration is coordinated with cash flow, marketing, and financing information. Point of sale of data is associated with individual names on credit cards, then combined with cascades of other data gleaned from the internet, generating behavior profiles that can be used for the fine-tuning of display and advertising strategies. The models of optimal future performance built on the analysis of past action are then relayed upstream to govern the behavior of workers, middle managers, and suppliers, so that you see the government of the way people behave in the productive process is based on information gained from the consumption process. So there's a kind of tightening of the web. The web has extended to touch everyone, and everyone is integrated into this gigantic and ever-accelerating process of production and consumption. So it's relayed upstream to govern the behavior of workers, middle managers, and suppliers, and downstream to influence consumers, creating what Westerman calls, and this is the terrifying thing, a unified data system, UDS, embracing every aspect of corporate planning. And then here's where the theorist comes in, myself. What appears on the horizon is a self-shaping or autopoetic modeling process that can integrate hundreds of millions of individuals and billions of discrete objects and desires into a single mobility system where every movement is coordinated with every other movement in real time. The integrative capacity of this kind of autopoetic system is what defines the boundary of each corporate entity struggling against all others to increase the market share it controls. In other words, the point of a corporation today is how much can it capture, how much can it integrate, about how many people and how many goods can it obtain information, and how can it process that to make that information what they call actionable. In other words, use it to control its suppliers, its own production, its warehousing, its distribution, its sales. So integrated, the boundary of a corporation, the boundary of this autopoetic self-creating entity is determined by the amount of information that it can integrate and act on. That's a definition of a corporation. Under these conditions, we live in a so-called open world of universal free trade across national borders, where giant organizations strive to impose closure on mobile populations. Their computerized map becomes our intimate territory. This is another attempt to describe what kind of society we're living in. We're living in a society where giant organizations make a map of mobile dynamics, of system dynamics, and try to impose that map, or try to make us part of their map, so that our most intimate things are accounted for in their system of production.
And predicted too.
And predicted. That's the thing, because it's a dynamic system, so it must include the future, otherwise it would be useless. Yeah, and this is, of course, there I'm becoming completely delirious. I mean, right? This is what appears on the horizon, but the horizon's not so far away. Wal-mart's data system is like they had when people started talking about it a few years ago, some 70 terabytes of information. It's the biggest private data system in the world. But it's been adopted, this thing has been adopted by Tesco, Ahold, Carrefour, and many other big, I think I have a list of them probably on the next page.
Yeah, you showed it already.
Oh, I already showed it, okay, yeah. So, and I don't know, maybe I conclude here. Such a dystopian state was once the exclusive province of science fiction, Philip K. Dick novels where androids dreamed of electric sheep. But the container, having spawned the big box, that's the big box store, now seems destined to bring a world-spanning containment strategy into being. The electronic dream is to maintain continuous contact between the global production system and you, the consumer, whose mobility need not signify uncertainty of behavior or of future for that matter. According to this dream, no desire should linger without a sale. The representational techniques that enable such a strategy have seen vast changes since the 1960s. Today they include what are called multi-agent systems, where the decisions of autonomous actors are simulated on both the supply and demand sides of the equation. On the basis of such simulations, J. Rod Forster is still around, multiple autopoietic systems are orchestrated into smoothly functioning machines serving unified purposes. Yet behind such sophisticated devices, one can still recognize the outlines of semi-automated environments where the individual flowchart of every object and actor is analyzed into the coordinated curves of system dynamics. Like the architectural plan for a global factory in motion, those intersecting curves define the social form of just-in-time production. And I want to suggest that what we're talking about here is a rhythmics of existence. And if 1,000 Plateaus starts with this thing, it's because they were very aware that this kind of rhythmics of existence was emerging. And the whole proposal of Deleuze and Guattari, generally in their later period, is that what you must do is somehow change the rhythm. This is of the essence, because it is through these, already in the Anti-Oedipus, they talk about flows and stocks. They were very aware of Forster. Deleuze, there's a course of Deleuze you can get it on the internet where he analyzes the system of basically Forster's systems. Of course, he refers to some French interpreter of Forster, but and the words I think they use, the other word for flow is rates. So the words that are used that you'll find is rates and stocks. But the system is the Forster system. And I know some people in the economics department at the Sorbonne, and I asked them about this, and they said, Forster is still, his system dynamics is still, basically industrial dynamics, is still the king of distribution, production and distribution today. It's used everywhere. They even use it for fisheries. They were explaining to me that fisheries, you know, the stocks, the flows, the reproduction of the fish, how it's consumed and all that is mapped out using the Forster type industrial dynamics models. And so what I want to suggest, and obviously what I'm going to get into for the conclusion of this course, is the question of this rhythm. How could we change these rhythms? And I think the question is really damn important when you look at what's happening now. I was just in China. As we know, China has been the site of tremendous industrial growth due to the system of just-in-time production, distribution, and consumption. Indeed, it's the low-cost labor of China that stimulated the development of all that and produced what you can call the Wal-mart world, which doesn't only concern that mysterious bicontinent of Shumerica, but also concerns all the industrialized nations. Now, what I just saw in China is incredible. It's not the factories and all that, because I already went and looked at factories in China before for previous research. This time, however, was a trip after 2008. Now, what's happened since 2008 is a tremendous decline in the amount of products, Chinese products, that Americans and Europeans are able to buy. Not because they don't have the desire, because they don't have the money. So, because of everything we're studying, the financial crisis, because the representation system itself is coming apart, and the money flows can't be kept up, consumers can no longer consume all that crap. Now that doesn't mean that the Chinese are just sitting there saying, "Where are you, my consumer?" What they're doing is they're changing their world. They're changing their world just as the Europeans and Americans changed their world long ago. They're starting to produce stuff for themselves. What that entails is the biggest building boom ever seen in human history. So I went with some friends on a so-called continental drift to the city of Wuhan. Basically, no one goes to Wuhan as a tourist. The only people that go to Wuhan are the some 30 million people who live there. And there are undoubtedly many, many more million people. Because Wuhan is something like the Chicago of China. Not because it has a derivatives market, it doesn't. But Chicago, you know, is the place where all the 6 intercontinental train systems actually meet. It's the only place. It's the hub of transport. So Wuhan is located on the Yangtze River. There's some major train lines that go north-south through it, and the river is the major east-west conduit of industrial growth in China. On that river you have the Three Gorges Dam, and behind it you have the mega industrial complex of Chongqing. So Wuhan has got a strategic location. Wuhan is huge. There are 2 rivers there, and there are 3 cities there. It's really a 3-city neighborhood, urban area. Wuhan is actually refers to 3 different cities already, but they're all on the banks of the river, and it operates as one urban area. What they're doing there, they're putting in a subway, they're tearing up all the streets, they're doing that. But what they want to do is build around Wuhan, which already has 30 million people. They want to build 8 cities around it. 8 cities around it, so that it becomes an urban network. It's very difficult when you don't speak Chinese to know where the hell you're going in China. We had somebody write the word for airport, and then we went out there and we said, like this. And the taxi guy said, we negotiated the price by writing the numbers on the paper. Get in the taxi, and we drive. And we talk, and we talk, and we drive. And we drive, and we drive, and we see, everywhere we see buildings being built. Not finished buildings. Everywhere we see buildings for about, it took us 15 minutes to get out. The road was very fast. We were going, 60, 70 miles to 70 miles an hour usually. With this suffocating fumes coming in and starting to cough and all that, and you get that burning sensation in your throat. And after about 45 minutes, we've been through half an hour where all we saw were buildings being built, being built, being built. And then, obviously we started to get really worried, are we going the right way? Is there actually an airport out there? Did he think we wanted to drive to Beijing or something? After an hour we reached the airport, we still weren't out of the urban area, and I became viscerally convinced that what I was seeing was the redirection of China's economy from an economy oriented towards export to an economy building new infrastructure. Now that would be great. I don't have anything. I want China to become a place where people can thrive, and I think every Chinese person has a right not only to their life, but also to their health, their happiness, and also the expansion of their culture and the recovery of the great Chinese culture. But the problem is that this kind of growth is totally unsustainable. I mean, already there are energy shortages in China. You can't get enough coal to heat all that stuff. Obviously, they will not be able to sell it in the near term either. They probably know, the government officials probably know that. Most people don't, though, and everyone will be shocked when there's a huge financial crisis in China and they're unable to sell all these buildings. But what I'm afraid is that people will be unable to live in them when they are sold, because they won't be able to stand the amount of coal that they will be able to burn. And you can see it already. I mean, the levels of pollution are incredible. But now there's this drive to urbanize, which is the result of having built up that huge economy of production on the basis of the just-in-time system, and therefore having oriented culturally and organizationally and technologically the whole country towards this frenetic kind of production for the goal of accumulating wealth in a good capitalist way, you know. Now that's going to result in an over-accumulation crisis, which will no longer be just economic but also environmental. It's already true, of course. I mean, it's already true on a big scale in North America and Europe. Pollution and all that was the big subject of the 70s, but it's actually still a big subject. We just are not able to people do, people talk about it a lot, but, Copenhagen came and went. Political change did not happen, But this is something, this is something, this is kind of what the shopping center, this is the untold story of the shopping center, if you will. And I just wanted to kind of bring it to that point to try to show you what the availability of credit money has unleashed. Because the whole function of the financial sphere, the whole productive function of it, is to produce money that capitalists can borrow in order to set up production equipment. That has been done on a massive scale since the emergence of the financial system. The financialized economy has not resulted in the growth of industrial plants in Western Europe and North America, but it has resulted in the growth of industrial plants all over the rest of the world, especially in Eastern Europe, in China, and especially there, as a matter of fact, in East Asia generally, not just China. Also India. Also Brazil, for instance, another place that's grown tremendously in these last years. And this growth has been much faster, immeasurably faster than the growth of previous epochs. For two reasons. One, because machines generally have become much more productive, but two, because capital has been much more widely available. So when you have the money, you can buy the machines, you can bring them. What's done is the machines are bought in the West, but the machines that are bought in the West are machines to produce machines. And then those machines are installed in China, and then they produce machines in China. And then those machines produce factories, and then the factories produce goods. And then there's the question of what to do with the goods, but there's also the question of what to do with the pollution. And those are the questions of the present. And they are as much a part of the development of the financial sphere as the speculative bubbles of people who want to make money with money. Because it's not just about money, it's not just about M and M prime, to use the Marxist notation. It's also about MC, money, commodity, M prime, more money. The two things go together, they're not separate. And the whole point of this exercise has been to show you that and also to suggest some of the consequences. So since those consequences are so vast, we should now take a break, talk about it a little over a glass of water or whatever it is we're going to drink.
Wine.
And get back to it after 15 minutes and no more pause.